The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump's heroic summit with North Korea is quickly imploding before his and our very eyes. Trump, during a meeting with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in yesterday, starting to refer to the summit in certainly more linguistically uncertain terms, like if it happens, and just generally using totally different language than the sort of inevitable and unstoppable victory language that he was using just a couple of weeks ago. Let's check out the video. Let's watch the full minute and a half or so to really try to gauge what Trump knows, what Trump is thinking at this time, and the sort of level of confidence that he's portraying, which is significantly lower than what it was just a couple weeks ago.
Just on where things stand with the summit, President Moon's national security advisor on the way here seemed to think that things are on track and that this will indeed happen.
Well, we're moving along, and we'll see what happens. There are certain conditions that we want, and I think we'll get those conditions. And if we don't have the meeting. And frankly, it has a chance to be a great, great meeting for North Korea and a great meeting for the world. If it doesn't happen, maybe it'll happen later. Maybe it'll happen at a different time. But we will see. But we are talking. The meeting scheduled, as you know, on June 12th in Singapore. And whether or not it happens, you'll be knowing pretty soon. But we're talking right now.
Do you have an idea of how denuclearization would take place? Would it be?
I do. I have a very strong idea how it takes place, and it must take place. That's what we're talking about. It must take place. So, but I have a very strong idea, and I have very strong opinions on the subject. I also have very strong opinions that North Korea has a chance to be a great country. And it can't be a great country under the circumstances that they're living right now. But North Korea has a chance, really, to be a great country, and I think they should seize the opportunity, and we'll soon find out whether or not they want to do that. Yes.
President, have you spoken to Kim Jong-un?
I don't want to say that.
Do you trust Kim Jong-un going into these meetings?
There's no reason to discuss that. I can say this, that for a short period of time, we've been dealing with North Korea, and it's been a good experience. We have 3 hostages back. They're home. They're living with their families. They're very, very happy. And so I can only speak for a very short period of time, but it's been a relationship that seems to be working, and we'll see how long it continues to work. Hopefully it's going to work for a long time, John.
So all of a sudden, if it happens, we hope it happens, we don't know, supposedly on June 12th, Trump now talking about conditions, not something he was talking about before. And this is not a surprise, right? Because from day one, Trump understood nothing about North Korea, right? First, Trump seemed to think it was notable that Kim Jong-un wanted to meet with him, as if it were an accomplishment, when, of course, North Korean leaders have been wanting to meet with American presidents for years, simply for the PR and the propaganda value of it. It's the American leaders who have chosen not to meet with Kim Jong-un. Then Trump clearly didn't understand that when North Korea said they'd stop nuclear research, it was after their main nuclear test site effectively fell apart. Then Trump had no idea that when North Korea says Korean denuclearization, that's code for American troops leaving South Korea. He seemed completely clueless about that. And then last week, we finally heard from North Korea that they're actually canceling a meeting with South Korea, threatening to cancel the summit with the United States if South Korea and the U.S. don't stop these military training exercises in the area. And then yesterday, as we discussed on the program extensively, we learned that Donald Trump's own staff is worried that Trump doesn't really fully grasp the situation in North Korea. So all along, it was clear that Trump was missing this sort of key basic knowledge about this. And now it seems to have gotten through to him that the entire thing might be a play to just make him look silly. And this is the clearest indication that there may be no summit whatsoever, and it is not at all shocking. And to be clear, I'm not cheering it, right? I've been advocating the humanitarian crisis in North Korea has been one of the sort of steadfast issues on this program for more than a decade. Since I became aware of the crisis, I have been wanting change for the better for the North Korean people. I want Trump to succeed on this to the extent that he's even a player in the situation. But there's never been an indication that Trump is actually set up to succeed. It's now becoming very clear publicly. The one way in which this is actually a good thing is that it's clear Trump can't actually handle the negotiations. It would really be bad if Trump had to sit down with Kim Jong-un. It would be truly bad because he's simply not capable of it. And I believe that over the long term, if the goal is improving circumstances for the North Korean people and for everybody else who might be affected by the threats of North Korea, keeping Trump away from Kim Jong-un might actually present the best chance for real improvements for the North Korean people. Adding to this chaos is a new report that Kim Jong-un is reportedly worried that when he leaves North Korea to go to Singapore for the summit next month, if indeed it happens on June 12th, that there could be a military coup that takes power away from him and he ends up out of power, which of course would be great. I don't know if it's accurate. There's that phrase, I forget who it's attributed to, correctly or incorrectly, something like, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. And I have no idea whatsoever whether it's actually likely that Kim Jong-un would be ousted from power by a military coup if he went to Singapore for a few days. But that certainly is in line with his long-standing paranoia and sort of the general paranoia of North Korean leaders, one after the other. So 0% surprise that this very quickly seems to be a summit that may never actually happen, and that might actually be for the better. One of the themes of the 2016 presidential election was that Donald Trump would endlessly repeat that the scandal is Hillary Clinton's emails. The disqualifier for Hillary Clinton as president was that she did not handle emails securely. She was careless with sensitive and secret information because of this email server that she had. She must be investigated ad nauseum forever, and she needs to be locked up, which Trump actually said would happen under his administration during the campaign. Immediately after being elected, said actually that's not going to really be a priority of my administration. And what I am here to tell you today is that if Hillary Clinton's emails deserved an investigation, Donald Trump's current iPhone use as president deserves 10 investigations. In the last 24 hours, we've learned something totally unsurprising, but still horrifying, which is that Donald Trump is shunning all security advice and using at least 2 iPhones regularly, and isn't allowing the iPhone that he uses for internet use to be scanned for hacking attempts and cyber attack threats because it is, quote, not convenient for him. He's got at least 2 iPhones that we know about. One can only make calls, no data on that phone. The other is for his internet use, posting to Twitter. Who knows what else he's doing on the internet. And Trump is refusing to have his Twitter phone checked for hacking attempts. President Obama, you might recall, had his BlackBerry taken away when he was president because of the security risk. These phones are prime targets, not just for your run-of-the-mill hackers, but for foreign intelligence agencies. And Obama, when his BlackBerry was taken away, was given a phone with no microphone, no camera, no GPS. It was screened once a month for security concerns. The entire case against Hillary Clinton's email server was, it's not a secured and approved government system, period. Donald Trump's iPhone is not an approved and secured government system. James Comey said Hillary Clinton was careless in her use of that email server. Donald Trump's behavior is the epitome of carelessness, and he was slamming Hillary for a private, non-governmental email server. He's using a private, non-governmental iPhone, and at least Hillary Clinton's email server was set up with some professional security protocols. And Trump slammed Hillary for negligence when it came to her emails. Donald Trump is literally neglecting the security imperatives that his staff is presenting to him and saying, we've got to get that phone checked because it's not convenient for him. And, you know, if Trump wasn't regularly doing monumental things on that phone, we might be able to make a different argument, although I don't think so. But Trump's tweets move the stock market. They can create or solve geopolitical problems. They dictate news headlines, and he's sending the tweets out from an unsecured iPhone that he will not have checked for breach attempts because apparently national security is not convenient for Donald Trump. Hey guys, I'm starting to think that maybe Republican outrage over Hillary's emails might not have been all about data security, Pat. Is that at all possible?
I mean, it would definitely be a big deal if Donald Trump's communications got hacked. But if you think about it, like the Trump administration has been playing scandal whack-a-mole for the entire time that they've been in office. So you have the Russia stuff, you have the Stormy Daniels stuff, you have like pay to play, and his whole cabinet is a mess of corruption. So I don't know if this ranks in the top 10 or so, but it just puts everything in context, because the Republican argument was that Hillary Clinton is not qualified to be president because she can't keep her communications secure. You can make the same argument now against Donald Trump, and it hits home.
That's why it's a big deal, because this was the reason you shouldn't have voted for Hillary, right? This was the reason why she was disqualified, according to Trump's narrative, from being president of the United States. And I've got to tell you something else. The idea that people might be trying to hack into Trump's iPhone, it's not some spy movie fantasy, because the Department of Homeland Security has detected mobile phone surveillance devices in Washington, D.C., and they don't know who they belong to. This was reported early last month, and we've talked about these devices called Stingray, and police will sometimes use Stingray devices at protests to eavesdrop on the phone communications of protesters. The Department of Homeland Security found Stingray-type devices, which are more generally called cell tower simulators, in Washington, D.C., and they weren't able to tie them to any particular local or federal law enforcement agency or operation. They've identified them. They're there, but it's not clear who's actually using those. Nothing matters anymore, and this is why we need to vote them out in 2018. And Pat's right that this is not even going to rank for the long list of scandals that the administration's been involved in. I can only be a broken record about this until November. And I'm warning you, it's a heads up, I'm going to be a broken record about this until November. The only way to deal with the hypocrisy, the swamp-filling corruption, the terrible policy ideas, everything that we're talking about, there's one way right now, which is to actually go out and vote in November of 2018, and I hope that you will do that. Send me your thoughts. Am I missing something about how the exact same thing that Donald Trump is doing is what he identified as the disqualifying actions of Hillary Clinton during the campaign? I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Eric Felix. Eric, thank you for supporting alternatives to homogenous, pond scum, swamp-filling corporate media. Today's longtime member of the day is Bruce Dugstad. Bruce, thank you for being a member all the way back to July of 2012. Bruce approaching his 6-year anniversary of membership. Join Eric, join Bruce, get all the great member benefits, including the world-famous bonus show, by signing up at joinpakman.com. Or if you want to say, I want something simpler than membership, you can pledge as little as $1 per month at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Okay, it's some people's favorite day of the week. It is time for Hatriot Mail.
Hey, let's face it. The only logical response to guns is more f***ing guns. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
Okay, this sometimes I need to provide context to Hatriot Mail. Sometimes I need some kind of introduction. Sometimes I need to define terms and speak a little bit at length. This week, I don't need to do that. We're going to go right into Hatriot Mail, and I'm going to need help, I think, figuring out what this one means.
Cuck Boy David. Having allergic reactions to the air, like the weakling cuck he is. I wonder how his girlfriend felt about that. Such a cucked immune system. No surprise he ended up in San Francisco, the epitome of Cuck Central. What with the disgusting sexual debauchery they're famous for, San Fran takes cuck to a whole new level.
The most notable element that distinguishes this Hatriot Mail from 99% of Hatriot Mail is that the vocabulary actually used words that are not usually in the parlance of the Hatriot, particularly the word debauchery. So that, you know, take it for what it's worth, but that's a distinguishing factor in some way, right?
Yeah, and I love the reverb on the David portion of the
Yeah,
Hatriot
so
Mail?
for people who don't know why that was there, my name was in triple parentheses, which is this way that I guess it's a white supremacist thing on the internet where you identify Jews without saying Jewish David Pakman by a triple parentheses. And the Hatriot interpretation of that is to present it with some reverb. And I think that is a really, really great thing. Send a middle finger to the Hatriots by using the coupon code Hatriot40 when you sign up for membership. If you go to joinpakman.com and when checking out, you type in the coupon code Hatriot40, you get 40% off and 6 Hatriots cry, which is a really, really great thing for a lot of people. We know that Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, is in big trouble, and it's actually very likely that he's going to be indicted. And it's one of the most direct paths to Donald Trump sort of across all investigations at this point. And there's this popular narrative about Michael Cohen, which is he just has this love for Donald Trump. He would do anything for Donald Trump. He would never cross Trump or betray Trump in any way. It is total, unending loyalty to Donald Trump by Michael Cohen, which supposedly is why Michael Cohen was willing to mortgage his own house to pay Stormy Daniels $130,000 in hush money that was not to be paid back by Donald Trump. Now, of course, we now know that Cohen was paid back by Donald Trump. And we've also learned that the business partner of Michael Cohen has flipped and is now cooperating with investigators. I'm talking about Evgeny Friedman, who happens to, of course, be a Russian immigrant known as the Taxi King. He has reached a deal with the New York Attorney General to flip, to cooperate as a government witness. And this is not good for Trump, okay? We don't really care about Cohen per se or in and of himself, but it's clear that Cohen's involved in very shady business, and it's clear that he's going to end up in serious trouble here. The question is whether that will reach Trump. And Trump's lawyers have already been thinking that Michael Cohen might end up flipping because there is just so much that the government has on him. With his business partner, Evgeny Friedman, now potentially telling investigators everything as part of a plea agreement that he has reached, the pressure, or rather a cooperation agreement, the pressure is going to mount on Cohen, and that could be disastrous for Donald Trump. And clearly, if anybody knows the bad things that Trump has done, or that Trump has authorized, or that Trump has paid for or been involved in to some degree, it's Michael Cohen. And you know that they're afraid because they've been trying to pretend like Michael Cohen just had nothing to do with anything at all, and nothing to do with the taxi business that Friedman managed for them. Rudy Giuliani recently said, quote, he's just not involved in the taxis. He has as much involvement in it as I do, which is a weird thing for Rudy Giuliani to say because it's known that Michael Cohen is involved with that taxi business. And of course, the taxi business itself is just a small part of what Cohen and his friends have been involved with over the last many years. But what I want to go back to for a second is Evgeny Friedman being Russian. Why do Russians keep popping up everywhere in this investigation? Every nook and cranny they look in, there's no deal that Michael Cohen had with a Sri Lankan that we ever hear about, or some kind of Chilean business person or whatever. Every nook and cranny they look in, a Russian just pops up out of nowhere. And Evgeny Friedman is one of those guys who has now pleaded guilty in state court. And that makes 6 guilty pleas so far connected to this entire fiasco. We've got George Papadopoulos, Michael Flynn, that Dutch guy, Van der Zwaan, Rick Gates, Richard Pinedo, and now Evgeny Friedman. And yeah, you know, they're connected to Trump to varying degrees. I would say Michael Flynn and George Papadopoulos, very much connected to Donald Trump. The Van der Zwaan guy, less connected. Evgeny Friedman, arguably not connected to Donald Trump at all. But the list is growing, and I think that when it's a witch hunt and you keep finding witches, you can't really call it a witch hunt anymore, right? It's just an investigation into criminal activity. And I'm increasingly thinking about the resignation recently of the New York Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, because these charges against Friedman were at the New York state level. We've talked about how the Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman of New York, was accused of sexually assaulting a couple of women. And we've known from the very beginning of this entire Trump-Russia thing that it's actually state charges that could bring down the criminal enterprise of Trump. And state charges, interestingly, cannot be pardoned by Donald Trump. Since Trump has been operating in New York City for a long time, the most likely candidate for state charges was always New York. Now, I want to be super clear. I'm not saying I don't believe the women who are accusing Eric Schneiderman of sexual assault. Everyone here knows that my instinct is, my default is, I believe the accusers on principle, and then I wait to find out more to see if anything surfaces that would question my belief in their accusations. That being said, it is very odd that the lawyer for the two women accusing Eric Schneiderman of sexual assault back in 2013 went to Michael Cohen, went to Donald Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, to talk about their allegations. And then those claims became public this year in 2018, when Eric Schneiderman is getting closer and closer to finding evidence of criminality among Trump's cronies. And all of a sudden, Eric Schneiderman abruptly resigns. It's a big coincidence. And I often say, Pat, I just tend to not really believe in huge coincidences. I believe in odds. And at a certain point, things that happen seem to really go against the odds unless there's more of an explanation to them.
I'm a little skeptical, though, because if this was all just a plan to oust Schneiderman,
yeah,
it's a little bit short-sighted because New York has a Democratic electorate. Whoever they elect to replace him would also be a liberal. But I guess it would just throw a wrench into the whole process because you can delay for at least a few months until the next one comes around.
I was thinking delay would be the name of the game, right? Like if there is some concerted effort here among Trump cronies to push Schneiderman out with the idea that that's the best way to delay non-pardonable state charges against these people, it's a matter of delaying, and who knows, maybe they'd be able to get out of office scot-free. In the meantime, we're going to try to find out more about this, and we will see what it means for Michael Cohen. But a very, very big deal. And again, because every single day at 5 o'clock, it's like scandal o'clock, a lot of these stories are going minimally reported to some degree. Discuss this with us on our subreddit with more than 6,000 other David Pakman Show viewers and listeners at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Coming up next, how would you manipulate the 2018 midterms if that's what you wanted to do?
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program Larry Norden, who's Deputy Director of the Democracy Program at NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice. Larry, for all the talk about what took place during the last election and sort of the importance of these midterm elections, depending on what your political views are, there's surprisingly little discussion of what has been done to ensure election integrity in these midterms that are coming up in November. So, I mean, I guess first, big picture it for us. Rate your confidence that we're going to have full and fair elections in November of 2018.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a good place to start when we're talking about this is what we mean by election interference. That term gets used a lot, particularly as applies to the 2016 election, and it can mean a number of things. In 2016, we know that the Russians, Kremlin-directed, purchased political ads purchased political ads on platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter and elsewhere, and that's something that we've gotten somewhat of a handle on. The government hasn't necessarily done all that much. I expect that we're likely to see some more of that stuff, but the social media companies themselves have done a little bit more about that, so that at least if and when that happens again in the 2016 election, and every reason to believe that it will, as I said, it'll be a little bit more obvious, and advocacy groups, the public, reporters can call that out when it happens. So that's one aspect. I think when you talk about election integrity, a lot of people talk about election integrity, they mean a second aspect, which is the election infrastructure itself. And there again, there are a few parts to that. There There are the voting machines, which I think is what most people go to immediately when they think about, is somebody messing with our elections through cyber attacks, and making sure that those are recording votes accurately. But there are also many other election systems that we use to conduct elections. They're the registration systems, right? That's what tells us who is entitled and not entitled to go vote on those machines in the first place. There are electronic poll books that might be used in polling places that we use to provide that registration data in the polling place on election day. There are election websites which might tell people what polling places to go to, and also provide election night reporting to vote totals. And we need to protect all of those. So in terms of how confident I am, we are doing much more than we ever had to secure that election infrastructure, in part in response to the 2016 election. There are far more cyber trainings of election officials to make them aware of how to defend the systems. Congress recently allocated $380 million to the states to spend on election system security. And there have been upgrades that have been happening at the state and county level of these various systems. Having said all that, we're not doing as much as I would like. And certainly I can point to specific things ahead of the 2018 election that I'd like to see happen that probably aren't going to happen, and I think we really need to push for ahead of 2020. Most obviously, we still have paperless voting machines in the U.S., which election system security experts are nearly unanimous. The Department of Homeland Security, the intelligence agencies, the intelligence committees from the Senate and the House have said these need to be replaced with systems that produce a paper record so that if there is some kind of intrusion against these systems, we can detect it, and we have a backup record that we can use to make sure that votes are accurate.
So along those lines, if I can jump in here with a few questions, when we talk about the reports that although there's no evidence that vote totals were changed by any kind of Russian targeting of voting systems, that those systems in 21 states, at least 21 states, were targeted. It appears as though in at least one case, Russian agents were able to access those systems, and exactly what that means, I guess, is something we could discuss. When you talk about having a paper verification of what votes were cast, is that a mechanism that would help to counteract whatever it is that might be done through the intrusions that were attempted in 21 states, or are we talking about two different things there?
Yeah, I want to be clear about this because this gets really confusing, especially to people that don't spend a lot of time in elections or studying elections. From everything we know that's been reported about those 21 states, those were not attacks on voting machines. Those were not attempts to break into voting machines. They were either attempts to scan or to breach either registration systems or election websites, right? So that's not where votes are counted and totaled. The one breach that we know about, and actually there was a Senate Intelligence Committee report that indicated that it was more than one state that had a breach. They didn't say how many, they said a small number. But the one state that we do know about is Illinois, and that was a breach into their registration system. And there was apparently an attempt to change some information in the registration rolls that was unsuccessful. Now you can imagine if somebody was successful in changing the rolls, the registration rolls, that could cause a lot of problems. If names are removed from a list or addresses changed so that when they show up to the polling place, they're not listed in the poll books. That could create problems. It might create long lines. The person should be given a provisional ballot, but unless they figure out what happened, that ballot might not be counted. So it's really important that states have backups of all of their registration information, and that they're auditing it, that they're checking it, and if there are problems, that there's some way to go back and figure out who should have been able to vote and to count those votes. Now that's completely separate from the other issue that we were just talking about, which is the voting machines themselves. Now those, it is theoretically possible that you could have malicious software reach those machines. It's theoretically possible that those machines could report incorrect results because they're running on software. And that's where having a paper record, now there's no evidence that that happened, I want to be clear, in the 2016 election.
Right.
But that's something that we want to be really concerned about, and we want to make sure that we have something in place that will allow us to detect if that happened and allow us to recover it if that happened. And the best something in place that we could have are paper records that the voter fills out or reviews, that we know the voter said, this is my vote.
Since you work on this issue from a few angles, Larry, I'm curious, and if this starts to get beyond sort of your focus, by all means tell us that you're sort of speculating, but if you were another country and your goal was to alter what would be the natural result of an election in the United States, what would actually be the most pragmatic path to that? Would it be trying to actually change vote tallies in machines to the extent that it's theoretically possible? Would it be disinformation campaigns through social media to actually get people to vote in a different way? I guess what I'm trying to say is, if we want to think about how we're most vulnerable to the election results being altered, what are the actual most effective paths to that if you're a foreign entity?
One thing I want to be clear about, actually, I think a good starting point is to look at what the Russians specifically have done in other countries, because they have interfered far more directly in other countries' elections in Eastern Europe than they apparently did in the United States in 2016. And one of the things that the intelligence agencies, intelligence community has told us, and the Senate Intelligence Committee said this as well, primary objective of the Russians, wherever they've operated, has been to just undermine confidence in the system in general.
Right.
In 2016, they actually did have an additional goal of favoring one candidate in the presidential race over another, but their overarching goal always is just to sow distrust in the system. And what the Russians have done elsewhere, pretty clearly, is they have targeted election night reporting, websites that deal with reporting either turnout or vote totals, that wouldn't necessarily, at the end of the day, change the outcome of the election if you have the kinds of redundancies that we have in place in the United States. But they would do, and awful sorry about my light there.
No problem, we can see you.
It could have a big impact on casting doubt in the election outcomes. And if you combine that with social media, and again, if you look at what the Facebook ads that were just released that the Russians had paid for in the 2016 election, some of them were focused on how you just can't trust the system. There's no point in voting. So there's this just general flow of information that is meant to cast doubt on the entire objective of liberal democracy.
Sure.
So that's point one. Now, point two, if I actually wanted to go in and change the results of, have some impact on changing the results of an election, look, there's election night reporting. We tally all our votes from machines, generally in a central place in a county or of a state, and so I might target those. But again, there are redundancies. So you have, a county might be reporting its votes that come in from all these polling places, but then you have the individual polling places and machines that are reporting results. So there's a good chance that you might, that you would, if you have good procedures in place, catch if there was at the county level or the state level with the tallies, what we call tally servers, if somehow those numbers were incorrect, that you would find them. And of course, again, going back to what I said earlier, that might be, if you're Russia and you're trying to undermine confidence in the system, that might be good enough. If I wanted to go after the voting machines where votes are counted, the most obvious place to go would be where there were no paper records, so that you wouldn't have this independent record to check. And this doesn't take a specialist in elections to understand. You would target critical counties and battleground states if we're doing something like a presidential election and hope for the best.
In the limited time we have left, other than the paper records of the ballots that are cast, what would be the other one or two things that you'd like changed?
Well, one thing for sure, and this is something that the Senate Intelligence Committee in its report emphasized, is doing thorough vulnerability assessments. This is something that the Department of Homeland Security offers. It looks at the entire system and basically says, here is where your weaknesses are. You need to understand where your weaknesses are and fix them. And that could be in the registration system. It could be in election websites. It could be in, in the voting machines themselves, in the way that you're totaling results and reporting them. Understanding all of that and where the weaknesses are is really important. And only 14 states, last I checked, had undertaken this kind of vulnerability assessment through DHS, the really detailed one. So that's number one. I'd like to see more states doing that. Secondly is just upgrading infrastructure more generally. Voting machines are really old in the United States. We've got 43 states that are using machines that are no longer manufactured, which too often means election officials are buying spare parts on eBay, which I don't think is particularly safe. You could say the same thing about registration databases. About 40 states are using databases that were created well over a decade ago. They may be running on, particularly at the county level, on software that's no longer vendor supported, which means it's not getting the kind of security patches that it should. So just a general investment in upgrading those things. The $380 million that Congress just gave to the states is a start for that kind of upgrade, but we definitely need more money than that.
Larry Norden, Deputy Director of the Democracy Program at NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice. Larry, thanks for talking to us about this again.
Thanks, as always. Thanks for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Back in 1964, the FBI anonymously sent Martin Luther King Jr. what's now known as a suicide letter. Some say it was encouraging Martin Luther King to kill himself. Others say, well, it wasn't really encouraging him to kill himself, but more encouraging him to maybe decline the Nobel Peace Prize or maybe to just pull back his public profile. And that letter is now public. It's public and mostly unredacted. And we're actually showing it to people who are watching along with us. You can find it online very, very easily. And along with this letter, the FBI sent Martin Luther King a tape recording of supposed sexual indiscretions. And that was sent both to Martin Luther King and a little earlier to his wife, Coretta Scott King. And that letter eventually became part of a much bigger scandal involving the FBI, which we don't have to talk about today in detail, but it's interesting to learn about and is widely documented at this point. This gets me to yesterday, when a Republican congressman named Brad Wenstrup went on Fox News and equated the investigation by FBI Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller right now to what the FBI did to Martin Luther King in the 1960s by allegedly, apparently, encouraging him to maybe commit suicide. It's almost beyond coherence, but I'm going to play the audio and video for you, simply to get it on the record and so that we can all have the same information to then discuss.
Right now, I want us to do our job. What our government set up for us to do, we have oversight over these agencies. If we turn that around and they feel that they don't have to answer to the American people, that is a basic problem and a tenet. Look, the types of things that we're hearing about now, it was wrong when they did it to Martin Luther King, and it's wrong if they do it to the Trump campaign. And we have the responsibility and the authority to have oversight over these things. And the American public are starting to get it, and they're tired of the stalling and the excuses coming from the Department of Justice and the FBI, and frankly, so are we.
So the FBI has since admitted that the behavior with the Martin Luther King thing was shameful, right? But there's nothing even alleged right now in any serious way, aside from the wild conspiracy theories of the right, that would make it similar to what took place with Martin Luther King in the 1960s. The FBI investigation by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller bears no similarity to what happened with Martin Luther King. The allegations of impropriety by the DOJ and FBI about supposed spies from Obama in the Trump campaign. I mean, the idea that this is anything other than a smear campaign meant to confuse people who don't even really know what the FBI Martin Luther King story is absolutely laughable. And what the idea is really is to make Trump the victim, right? Rather than Trump being the possible criminal perpetrator, which he is and which he's being investigated for, the idea is to put Trump in the position of the victim. He's the guy who's being unfairly targeted by Republicans like James Comey and Robert Mueller. He's the guy who was spied on during his campaign. He's the guy whose personal lawyer is being railroaded by these unfair raids at his office and his condo and his hotel room or whatever. And what's happening here is that all the Republican conspiracies about this huge concerted FBI effort to take down Trump, one which again would be mostly carried out by Republicans like Comey and Robert Mueller, the stories are falling completely flat with everybody but the most committed and extreme Trumpists. So now people like Congressman Wenstrup are going for this very weak form of ad hominem. They say the FBI is doing the same thing now to Trump that they did to Martin Luther King in 1964. And this Wenstrup guy is the same congressman who said back when Hope Hicks admitted to lying for Donald Trump, it's no big deal that she's lying because they were all white lies, and there's no more reason whatsoever to look at an official from the White House admitting to lying on the behalf of the President of the United States. They're throwing anything they can think of at the wall to see what sticks, and this is just the latest. And this, of course, says nothing about the absurdity of even equating Trump to Martin Luther King in any way, right? I mean, like, so the number one thing is there's nothing about what the FBI is doing now that's similar to what the FBI did to Martin Luther King. But deep down in that analogy, on some level, there's the idea that in some way Trump is a figure that is some way equatable to who Martin Luther King was. I don't feel that I really need to discuss that any further, but certainly nothing there as well. But that the idea that someone would even have the audacity to show up on Fox News and do this is stunning. And it's actually stunning at this point that I'm even stunned that they're willing to do this, right? They've been willing to do everything as the pressure continues to mount. Why am I even surprised that they're also willing to go out and say that this is like when the FBI encouraged Martin Luther King to kill himself? Investigating corrupt actions by government actors is nothing like telling a civil rights leader to kill themselves. I want to talk about a really interesting email that came in from a viewer, and it's so interesting, in fact, that I want to devote a segment to it today. This is an email I received from Alan, who wrote to me and said, David, do you think strawmanning, oversimplification, and extremism is necessary in order to initiate movement regarding an issue? A lot of people don't have the interest, patience, time, or intelligence to really dig deep on an issue. Of course, strawmanning can be very unfair and obviously very divisive. But to some degree, I think that it can be an effective way to fight the battle of ideas. For example, the right-wing stance on guns is often seen by the left as a result of rich politicians and gun owners not caring about the slaughter of children. I personally don't buy that, but if I did, I'd be pissed off and yelling in the streets too. So basically what Alan is asking me is whether the simple, unenhanced, unembellished truth is enough to inspire activism, or whether you sort of need to exaggerate the other side's position to get people activating around a political issue. So let's take the three one at a time, right? We have strawmanning, oversimplification, and extremism. Strawmanning. Strawmanning is distorting someone else's position to make it easier to refute or argue against. So you could strawman the pro-gun views of people by saying they don't care about dead children. Is that literally true? But probably not. But if you believe that their policy in support of gun rights leads to dead children, you might tell yourself, I'm okay strawmanning their position because it's a useful idea to get support. Another example would be, like, imagine a politician who's in favor of tax cuts for the rich. You could strawman their position by saying they don't care about destroying the economy, when the truth is they just don't believe tax cuts for the rich are bad for the economy, and it's much easier to argue against the strawmanned position. I don't think strawmanning is necessary to create political activism. I also don't think extremism is necessary to create political activism. But I do want to talk about simplification and oversimplification. I think that it is very useful maybe not always necessary, but oversimplification is often a good tool. The truth is that life is complex. Most people don't work in politics. Most people are busy living their lives and earning a living. And it is often useful and not dishonest to simplify an issue in order to get people to see why it's important. Most issues just aren't black and white, but that doesn't mean that it's a huge gray area that's not closer to one side or the other. I believe it is not dishonest to simplify issues. For example, abortion being about controlling women. The truth is that it's more complex, right? There's a debate about when life starts. There's a big religious component. There's a lot going on. But the impact of the religious rights position and the conservative rights position on abortion is one where women are not going to be allowed to decide about their own bodies, period. So I believe that it is useful to simplify the issue in those terms. I believe it's useful and not dishonest to simplify the issue of net neutrality to freedom on the internet from corporate power. It's more complex, it's regulatory, it's technical, there's a lot of stuff going on. But in some fundamental way, that really is what it's about. It's about freedom from corporate power on the internet. Climate change, to give one more example. Climate change is nuanced. It requires some understanding of science. It can be technical. But it's not wrong to inspire activism by saying, we're wrecking the only planet we have, and every day we don't fix it, we're closer to our own destruction. That will catalyze activism much more than talking about carbon data from the last 800,000 years. And I do think that it's useful and not at all dishonest. Some people may disagree with me. Others may agree with the idea that simplification is okay, but not on the issues that I think it's okay on. But I'm really, really interested to hear from people on this. Is it fundamentally dishonest to simplify an issue, not to straw man, not to take extremist positions, but to simplify and distill it to its most important points? I think the answer is that it's okay, but I want to hear from people about this. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a voicemail from a very, very angry Troy York who's really pissed off that I didn't cover a story that I actually covered last week. Let's take a listen to this voicemail from Troy York.
I was wondering why you haven't said nothing about the man who was at a Fresh Kitchen. I believe his name is Eric Schlossberg in midtown Manhattan, and he was telling these Spanish people not to speak Spanish, and I was wondering if they hit home with you. I thought maybe you didn't say nothing because he looks like a buddy of yours. Isn't he a drinking pal of yours, Pac-Man? He looks like someone you would hang around with, and basically, I think him calling out the workers and threatening to call the CIA and ICE and is a good idea, Pac-Man, because these people, if you're not speaking English or learning English, then what are you trying to assimilate or just being a colonist and a cultural jingoist supremacist? So just waiting for you to talk about this Schlossberger, this Jewish lawyer in Midtown Manhattan. I bet he's a buddy of yours, Pac-Man.
Okay. Troy York, of course, missing that. I covered the story last week, so I did talk about it. He seemed to be on something during that voicemail. That was an unusual rambling voicemail, even for Troy York standards. But I talked about the story last week, buddy. Not a story that I missed. And his name is I think it's Aaron Schlossberg, or it wasn't Eric. I think it was Aaron Schlossberg. Okay, we've got a great bonus show coming up for you today. Access the bonus show by being a member at joinpacman.com or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. The world-famous bonus show coming up next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.